An empath does not set out to reveal the inner wounds of others, nor do they consciously attempt to analyze or expose emotional pain. The mirroring happens quietly, almost invisibly, through presence alone. In psychological terms, this mirroring operates at a level beneath conscious intention. Carl Jung described the psyche as a layered structure, where much of human behavior is guided not by awareness, but by the unconscious. When an empath enters a relationship or social environment, their openness, emotional attunement, and lack of defensive masking create a psychological surface that reflects what others have buried within themselves. Most people learn early in life that certain emotions are unacceptable. Fear may be labeled as weakness, sensitivity as fragility, grief as inconvenience, and compassion as something to be exploited. Over time, these emotions are pushed down, not resolved but stored in the unconscious. Jung referred to this accumulation as part of the shadow, the rejected aspects of the self that remain alive beneath the personality. These buried elements continue to influence behavior, relationships, and self-worth, even when the individual believes they have moved beyond them. The empath, by contrast, tends to remain emotionally permeable. Instead of sealing off painful feelings, they develop an ability to sit with them, both in themselves and in others. This does not mean empaths are free from wounds. Often, they carry deep emotional histories. The difference lies in how those wounds are processed. Rather than being denied, they are acknowledged. This acknowledgement creates emotional coherence, a state in which inner experience aligns with outer expression. Jung believed this alignment was a key step toward individuation, the process of becoming psychologically whole. When someone who has repressed their wounds encounters an empath, a subtle psychological interaction begins. The empath's emotional transparency acts as a reflective surface. Without saying a word, they evoke feelings in the other person that have long been avoided. This can occur through simple acts: attentive listening, genuine concern, emotional honesty, or even silence that does not rush to fill discomfort. The other person may suddenly feel uneasy, exposed, or emotionally stirred without understanding why. This reaction is not caused by anything the empath is doing deliberately. It is caused by what the empath is not doing. They are not hiding, not performing, not manipulating their emotional presentation to maintain control. Jung emphasized that the unconscious recognizes authenticity instinctively. When faced with it, the psyche responds, often defensively. The empath's authenticity contrasts sharply with the emotional armor worn by others, making that armor suddenly visible. Mirroring, in this sense, is not imitation. It is resonance. The empath's nervous system is attuned to subtle emotional frequencies. When someone carries unresolved grief, shame, or anger, the empath senses it and responds naturally, perhaps with compassion, patience, or emotional availability. This response highlights the wound rather than soothing it away. The wounded individual may feel seen without having chosen to be seen, and this can be deeply unsettling. Jung noted that what remains unconscious seeks expression. When it cannot be expressed internally, it is encountered externally through projection. The empath becomes the screen upon which the other person's unresolved emotional material is projected. The individual may feel that the empath makes them feel weak, inadequate, exposed, or judged, even when no judgment exists. In reality, the empath has activated an internal dialogue that the person has avoided for years. This is why reactions to empaths are often extreme. Some people feel immediate comfort and safety, sensing an opportunity for emotional release and healing. Others feel irritation, envy, or hostility. These reactions reveal more about the observer than the empath. Jung believed that strong emotional responses are indicators of unconscious content being activated. Indifference rarely signals depth, intensity does. The mirroring effect becomes especially powerful in relationships where there is pretense of love or closeness. When someone claims affection for an empath but has not confronted their own emotional wounds, the relationship becomes a psychological battleground. On the surface, there may be warmth, praise, or loyalty. Beneath it, there is tension. The empath's presence continually reflects the emotional work the other person has avoided. Love becomes conditional, shaped by how well the empath suppresses their authenticity to maintain harmony. In such dynamics, the wounded individual may unconsciously demand that the empath become less empathic. They may criticize sensitivity, mock intuition, or frame emotional depth as impractical or excessive. These behaviors are defenses. Jung would describe them as attempts by the ego to protect itself from being overwhelmed by shadow material. Rather than integrate the wound, the person tries to eliminate the mirror. The empath often senses this shift before it is expressed verbally. There is a change in tone, in emotional reciprocity, in the quality of connection. Begins to feel, cell, danes. This is because the empath is absorbing not only expressed emotions, but suppressed ones. Without clear boundaries, the empath may internalize the discomfort, mistaking projection for personal failure. Jung warned that sensitive individuals are especially vulnerable to this form of psychological contamination. The unconscious mirroring also explains why empaths are frequently accused of things they have not done. They may be labeled as manipulative when they are simply perceptive, judgmental when they are observant, or arrogant when they are self-aware. These accusations reflect disowned traits in the accuser. The empath's clarity highlights the accuser's confusion. The empath's emotional literacy exposes the accuser's emotional illiteracy. Jung's concept of the shadow helps clarify why this process feels threatening. To confront one's wounds is to confront vulnerability, regret, and unresolved pain. Many people build their identities around avoidance. They define themselves by productivity, control, status, or dominance, using these traits to outrun emotional truth. The empath, by embodying emotional presence rather than avoidance, disrupts this strategy. Importantly, the empath does not need to speak about psychology or emotions for the mirroring to occur. Silence can be just as powerful. A calm, grounded presence can amplify another person's inner chaos. The psyche fills silence with unconscious material. When the empath does not rush to distract, fix, or dominate the emotional space, the other person is left alone with themselves. This is often when envy begins to form. Envy arises not from what the empath has externally, but from what they represent internally. Emotional integration, self-awareness, and the courage to feel are qualities many people long for but fear. Seeing these qualities embodied effortlessly by another person can trigger a painful sense of lack. Jung described this as the suffering of comparison, where the ego recognizes its own incompleteness. Rather than admitting this lack, the psyche defends itself. The empath is devalued, dismissed, or subtly undermined. Love becomes performative because genuine connection would require emotional honesty. The mirroring continues, however, regardless of these defenses. The empath's presence remains a reminder of unfinished inner work. For the empath, understanding this unconscious mirroring is essential for psychological survival. Without this understanding, they may believe they are responsible for the discomfort of others. Jung emphasized that individuation requires discernment, the ability to differentiate between what belongs to the self and what belongs to others. Empaths must learn that not every emotional reaction they trigger is an invitation to fix or heal. At a deeper level, the mirroring effect serves a collective psychological function. Empaths act as catalysts. They bring unconscious material to the surface of relationships, families, and communities. While this role is often lonely and misunderstood, it aligns with Jung's belief that psychological growth rarely occurs without discomfort. The empath does not cause the wound, they reveal it. This revelation can lead to transformation if the individual chooses to engage with it consciously. Some people, after initial discomfort, begin to reflect, question, and integrate their emotional wounds. In these cases, the empath becomes a companion in growth. But when the individual refuses this process, the relationship deteriorates. Love collapses under the weight of unacknowledged envy and projection. Ultimately, the unconscious mirroring performed by empaths is not a flaw or a burden, but a byproduct of emotional authenticity. Jung believed that the psyche strives toward wholeness even when the ego resists. Empaths, by living close to their emotional truth, align themselves with this natural movement. They remind others, often painfully, of what has been lost, buried, or denied. The discomfort they provoke is not a sign of harm, but of contact. Contact with the unconscious is rarely gentle. It shakes illusions and destabilizes false identities. For those unwilling to face their inner wounds, the empath becomes a symbol of threat. For those willing, the empath becomes a mirror not of shame, but of possibility. Envy does not arise simply because one person has more than another. It is born in a much deeper psychological territory, one that Carl Jung explored extensively through his concept of the shadow. The shadow represents all the traits, emotions, desires, and potentials that a person has rejected or suppressed because they were once judged as unacceptable, dangerous, or shameful. These rejected elements do not disappear. They retreat into the unconscious, where they continue to influence behavior, relationships, and emotional reactions. When envy appears, it is often a signal that the shadow has been stirred. In the presence of an empath, this stirring becomes almost inevitable. Empaths tend to live with qualities that many people have pushed into their shadow: emotional sensitivity, compassion, vulnerability, intuition, and moral awareness. These qualities are not universally encouraged. In many cultures and families, they are associated with weakness, impracticality, or emotional risk. As a result, people learn to suppress them in order to survive, succeed, or be accepted. Over time, the personality becomes organized around what is allowed, while what is forbidden sinks into the unconscious. Jung emphasized that the shadow is not evil in itself. It is simply what has not been lived. However, when the shadow remains unintegrated, it begins to express itself indirectly. Envy is one of its most common expressions. When a person encounters someone who openly embodies traits they have disowned, the psyche reacts with discomfort. The empath becomes a living reminder of an inner loss. This reminder is painful because it exposes the gap between who the person is and who they could have been. The pain of this recognition is rarely conscious. Most people do not think, "I envy this person because they live authentically and I do not." Instead, the emotion disguises itself. It may appear as irritation, criticism, suspicion, or moral judgment. Jung observed that the ego is highly skilled at protecting itself from shame. Rather than admitting inner deficiency, it projects negativity outward. The empath is then experienced not as inspiring, but as threatening or irritating. This is why envy toward empaths often carries a moral or emotional charge. The empath may be accused of being too sensitive, too emotional, too intense, or unrealistic. These criticisms are not objective assessments, they are defenses. They allow the envious person to devalue what they secretly desire but fear reclaiming. By framing empathy as a flaw, the ego avoids confronting the pain of having abandoned it. The shadow becomes particularly volatile when it contains positive traits. Jung pointed out that people often associate the shadow only with dark impulses such as anger or selfishness, but this is incomplete. The shadow also contains unlived virtues. A person may have repressed kindness to appear strong, intuition to appear rational, or emotional honesty to avoid rejection. When these virtues are encountered in another person, the reaction can be just as intense as when darker traits are triggered. Empaths activate this positive shadow. Their presence challenges the unconscious agreement a person has made with themselves. That sensitivity is unsafe, that emotional depth leads to suffering, that caring too much results in exploitation. Seeing someone live with these qualities and still retain dignity, influence, or inner peace destabilizes that agreement. The psyche experiences this as a threat to its defensive structure. Envy then becomes a way to restore psychological balance without growth. By resenting the empath, the person avoids the deeper task of shadow integration. Jung believed that true psychological maturity requires facing the shadow consciously, acknowledging both its dark and bright aspects. Without this integration, the shadow seeks expression through projection. The empath becomes the target. This process is intensified when the empath receives recognition, trust, or emotional closeness from others. The envious individual may feel overlooked, invisible, or replaceable. These feelings tap into old wounds of inadequacy that were never healed. Rather than addressing these wounds, the psyche externalizes them. The empath is perceived as undeserving, manipulative, or favored unfairly. In reality, the pain originates from the person's own unresolved sense of worth. In relationships where love is claimed but not grounded in self-awareness, envy becomes especially destructive. The person may genuinely care for the empath, yet feel increasingly uncomfortable as the empath's authenticity highlights their own emotional fragmentation. Jung noted that love without self-knowledge often collapses under the weight of unconscious material. The shadow, when ignored, poisons intimacy. This is why envy from such individuals often appears subtle rather than overt. It may take the form of passive resistance, emotional withdrawal, faint praise, or disguised competition. The person does not want to lose the empath's presence because it provides emotional nourishment. At the same time, they resent the empath for revealing what they have not integrated within themselves. The relationship becomes internally contradictory. The unintegrated shadow also distorts perception. The envious person may reinterpret the empath's actions through a lens of suspicion. Compassion is seen as manipulation. Emotional honesty is seen as attention, seeking. Boundaries are seen as rejection. Jung explained that projection alters reality by replacing perception with unconscious fantasy. The empath is no longer seen as they are, but as a symbolic figure representing inner conflict. This distortion allows envy to justify itself. The person convinces themselves that their negative feelings are rational responses to the empath's supposed flaws. In doing so, they avoid confronting the real source of discomfort. Jung warned that this mechanism can persist for years, shaping entire relationship patterns. People may repeatedly encounter empaths and experience the same reactions, never realizing that the conflict originates within. The tragedy of unintegrated shadow envy is that it blocks growth. Every encounter with an empath is an opportunity to reclaim lost parts of the self. Sensitivity, emotional awareness, and compassion can be reintegrated consciously, enriching the personality. But this requires humility and courage. It requires admitting that something valuable was sacrificed along the way. For many, this admission feels more threatening than resentment. Empaths often sense this tension intuitively. They may feel admired and resented simultaneously. Jung would describe this as ambivalence, a sign that unconscious material is active. The empath may feel drained or confused, especially if they internalize the envy directed toward them. Without awareness, they may attempt to shrink themselves, suppress their qualities, or overgive in an attempt to restore harmony. This self-diminishment does not resolve envy. In fact, it often deepens it. When the empath suppresses their authenticity, the envious person is not relieved, they are unsettled. The mirror becomes distorted, but the underlying conflict remains. Jung emphasized that denying one's nature to accommodate another's unconsciousness leads to neurosis rather than connection. From a Jungian perspective, envy is not the enemy, it is a symptom. It signals that something important has been split off from consciousness. When envy arises in response to an empath, it reveals a hunger for emotional wholeness. The problem lies not in feeling envy, but in refusing to examine it. For those who are willing to engage in shadow work, the presence of an empath can be transformative. Instead of resenting sensitivity, they begin to explore their own. Instead of attacking emotional depth, they rediscover it within themselves. Jung believed that projection, once recognized, can be withdrawn. The energy trapped in envy is then released for growth. However, when shadow integration is resisted, envy hardens into hostility. The empath becomes a symbol of everything the person fears confronting. Love turns conditional, warmth turns cold, and connection becomes competition. The psyche chooses stagnation over transformation. Understanding this dynamic is essential for empaths. It allows them to depersonalize envy and recognize it as an expression of another person's inner struggle. Jung taught that psychological boundaries are as important as emotional openness. Empaths must learn to observe rather than absorb the projections directed toward them. At a deeper level, unintegrated shadow, envy reflects a collective psychological issue. Modern societies often reward emotional detachment, productivity, and control, while marginalizing empathy and introspection. Empaths stand in quiet opposition to these values simply by existing. Their presence challenges collective shadows as well as individual ones. In this sense, the envy they trigger is not only personal, but cultural. It reflects a widespread disconnection from inner life. Jung believed that healing begins when individuals reclaim their rejected qualities. Until then, those qualities will continue to appear in others, provoking admiration, discomfort, and envy. The empath, then, is not the cause of envy, but the catalyst. They illuminate what has been left behind. For those unwilling to look inward, this illumination feels like an accusation. For those willing, it becomes an invitation to wholeness. Love that is authentic does not require performance. It does not need exaggeration, constant reassurance, or strategic displays of loyalty. It grows naturally from inner stability and self-acceptance. When love becomes something that must be acted out, displayed, or repeatedly proven, It often signals an underlying psychological defense. Carl Jung understood this phenomenon as the ego's attempt to protect itself from feelings of inadequacy. In such cases, pretended love is not a lie in the conscious sense, but a compensation for an inner void the individual has not faced. Many people construct an identity that is designed to be acceptable, admirable, or powerful. This identity is shaped by early experiences where approval was conditional. Emotional needs may have been ignored, vulnerability may have been punished, and authenticity may have resulted in rejection. To survive, the psyche learns to perform. It adopts behaviors and attitudes that secure connection without risking exposure. Over time, this performance becomes habitual, and the individual may no longer recognize the difference between genuine feeling and defensive attachment. In relationships with empaths, this defensive structure is tested. Empaths respond to emotional truth rather than surface behavior. They sense incongruence instinctively. When affection is expressed without emotional depth, when care is offered without presence, the empath feels it. This is not judgment, it is perception. Jung emphasized that the unconscious communicates through feeling tones long before words. The empath picks up on these tones effortlessly. Pretended love functions as a shield against inner inadequacy. The person offers affection, praise, or commitment, not from fullness, but from fear. Fear of being abandoned, fear of being exposed, fear of being seen as insufficient. Love becomes a tool rather than a connection. Jung described this as a form of persona inflation, where the social mask grows stronger as the true self weakens. This dynamic creates a subtle power imbalance. The person performing love gains a sense of control by appearing caring, supportive, or indispensable. The empath, however, does not respond to performance alone. They seek resonance. When resonance is absent, tension arises. The performer may feel unappreciated, confused, or threatened. Their effort is not yielding the emotional security they expected. At this point, inner inadequacy begins to surface. The presence of an empath, who offers genuine emotional engagement without manipulation, highlights the artificiality of the performer's attachment. Jung believed that the psyche reacts strongly when illusions are threatened. Rather than questioning their own emotional foundation, the individual may double down on performance, becoming more demonstrative, more possessive, or more morally assertive. This escalation often masks a growing sense of inner emptiness. The person begins to feel that no matter how much they give, it is never enough. They may interpret the empath's emotional independence as rejection. In reality, the empath's independence comes from inner coherence. They are not seeking to be completed by another person. For someone whose sense of worth depends on relational performance, this is deeply unsettling. Envy emerges at this stage, not because the empath has more love, but because they do not need to perform to be whole. Jung associated envy with the recognition of an unfulfilled potential. The performer unconsciously realizes that their love is conditional, while the empath's is rooted in self-connection. This realization threatens the ego's narrative of being generous, caring, or morally superior. Pretended love then shifts into subtle competition. The person may begin to measure, compare, and evaluate emotional exchanges. Who gives more? Who sacrifices more? Who is more loyal? These questions are not asked openly, but they shape behavior. Jung noted that when love becomes a ledger, it has already lost its essence. The empath often experiences this shift as emotional pressure. They may feel guilted into reciprocating affection they cannot authentically match. They may sense that their natural way of loving is being scrutinized. This scrutiny is not about connection, but validation. The performer needs constant confirmation that their role is working, that they are lovable, that they are enough. Inner inadequacy is rarely acknowledged directly. It hides behind righteousness, self, pity, or martyrdom. The person may frame themselves as the one who cares more, tries harder, or sacrifices more. This narrative protects the ego from confronting the deeper truth, that their sense of worth is externally sourced. Jung warned that when the ego relies on external validation, relationships become arenas of unconscious conflict rather than mutual growth. The empath's authenticity disrupts this arrangement. They do not overextend to prove love. They do not collapse when validation is withheld. They remain emotionally present without clinging. This stability highlights the performer's dependency. Envy intensifies because the empath embodies emotional autonomy, something the performer lacks but desperately wants. At this point, love may become conditional in subtle ways. Warmth is offered when the empath conforms to expectations and withdrawn when they do not. Praise becomes selective. Support becomes transactional. Jung would describe this as a regression to primitive relational patterns, where love is tied to compliance. The performer is not consciously manipulating. They are reenacting early attachment strategies that once ensured survival. The empath senses this conditionality. What once felt like care now feels controlling. Emotional safety erodes. Yet the performer continues to insist on their love, often with great conviction. This insistence is itself a defense. If they can convince the empath of their devotion, they do not have to question its authenticity. Envy becomes intertwined with fear at this stage. Fear of losing the empath, fear of being exposed as emotionally hollow, fear of confronting unresolved wounds. Jung emphasized that fear often disguises itself as aggression or moral superiority. The performer may criticize the empath's boundaries, accuse them of being distant, or frame their emotional autonomy as selfishness. This distortion serves a psychological purpose. It shifts focus away from inner inadequacy and onto the empath's supposed shortcomings. The empath becomes the problem. Their refusal to engage in emotional performance is reinterpreted as a lack of love. This inversion allows the performer to maintain their self-image while discharging uncomfortable feelings. The tragedy of pretended love is that it prevents genuine intimacy. By avoiding vulnerability, the person ensures that they are never truly known. They may be surrounded by relationships, yet feel profoundly alone. Jung believed that the soul suffers when it cannot express its true nature. This suffering often manifests as envy toward those who live more honestly. For the empath, this dynamic is exhausting. They may attempt to reassure, explain, or adapt, believing the issue lies in communication. But no amount of explanation can fill an inner void that has not been addressed. Jung would caution against trying to heal another's unconscious at the cost of one's own integrity. Understanding pretended love as a defense against inadequacy allows the empath to depersonalize the behavior. It is not a failure of worth, but a reflection of another's unfinished inner work. This understanding does not require tolerance of mistreatment, but it does offer clarity. At a deeper level, this dynamic reflects a broader psychological pattern. Many people are taught to perform love before they learn to feel it. They are rewarded for appearances rather than presence. Empaths, by valuing emotional truth over performance, challenge this conditioning. Their presence reveals how rare genuine love actually is. Jung believed that love, like individuation, requires courage. It requires facing one's emptiness without disguises. When this courage is lacking, love becomes a role. Envy then becomes inevitable because roles cannot compete with authenticity. The empath does not try to be loved. They are connected to themselves. And this self-connection is what exposes the performer's inner inadequacy most painfully. In the end, pretended love is not the opposite of love, but a substitute for it. It arises where fear has replaced trust and image has replaced presence. The empath, by remaining emotionally real, becomes a silent invitation to drop the mask. Whether that invitation is accepted or resented depends on the individual's willingness to face themselves. Emotional authenticity carries a quiet power that does not announce itself. It does not dominate, persuade, or demand attention. Yet it has a destabilizing effect on people who rely on carefully constructed self-images to navigate the world. Carl Jung understood the self-image as part of the persona, the mask the ego presents to gain acceptance, status, and safety. When this persona becomes rigid, it begins to replace the true self. Any encounter with genuine emotional expression then feels threatening, not because it is aggressive, but because it exposes the fragility of the mask. A false self-image is built from adaptation. It forms when a person learns which parts of themselves are rewarded and which are rejected. Over time, they emphasize the acceptable traits and suppress the rest. This process can create success, approval, and even admiration, but it comes at a psychological cost. The disowned parts do not disappear. They remain active in the unconscious, shaping mood, relationships, and self-esteem. Jung believed that the greater the distance between the persona and the true self, the greater the inner tension. When an emotionally authentic person enters this psychological landscape, the tension becomes visible. The authentic individual does not rely on performance to feel real. Their words align with their feelings. Their boundaries align with their values. This alignment sends a powerful signal to the unconscious of others. It suggests that another way of being is possible. For those invested in maintaining a false self-image, this suggestion feels like an accusation. The threat does not come from comparison alone, but from exposure. Emotional authenticity highlights inconsistency. It reveals how much effort is required to maintain the persona. Jung observed that the ego fears exposure more than failure. Failure can be explained or rationalized, but exposure dismantles the illusion of control. When the authentic individual remains steady without performing, the performer's effort becomes obvious. This dynamic is often unconscious. The person with a false self-image may not articulate why they feel uneasy, irritated, or defensive. They simply sense that something about the authentic person undermines their stability. The reaction may be subtle: dismissiveness, sarcasm, moral judgment, or withdrawal. These are not random behaviors. They are attempts to reassert the superiority of the persona and protect the ego from collapse. False self-images are often reinforced by social roles. Someone may define themselves as the responsible one, the strong one, the intellectual one, or the selfless one. These identities provide structure and predictability. Emotional authenticity, however, does not conform neatly to roles. It is responsive rather than scripted. This flexibility threatens those who depend on fixed identities to feel secure. The presence of an empath intensifies this threat. Empaths do not merely express emotions, they perceive them. They notice incongruence between words and feelings, actions and intentions. Even when they say nothing, their awareness is felt. Jung believed that being seen without disguise can feel like a psychological invasion to someone who has lived behind a mask. The empath's attention penetrates the persona, touching the vulnerable self beneath. This experience can trigger defensiveness. The person may accuse the empath of being intrusive, judgmental, or emotionally excessive. In reality, the discomfort arises from being perceived too accurately. The false self-image depends on selective visibility. It reveals what supports the narrative and hides what contradicts it. Emotional authenticity disrupts this control. The threat becomes more pronounced in close relationships. Intimacy requires consistency between inner and outer life. When one person operates from authenticity and the other from persona, imbalance emerges. The authentic person's grounded presence highlights the artificiality of the relationship's emotional tone. Jung noted that relationships often serve as mirrors for the psyche. When the reflection becomes too clear, avoidance follows. To preserve the false self-image, the person may attempt to reshape the authentic individual. They may encourage them to be less sensitive, less direct, or less honest. These suggestions are framed as advice or concern, but they function as defenses. If the empath conforms, the threat diminishes. If not, the person may withdraw emotionally or become critical. This dynamic reveals a deeper fear that the false self-image will collapse under scrutiny. Jung emphasized that the ego clings to familiar structures even when they cause suffering. The persona provides predictability. Authenticity introduces uncertainty. It requires ongoing self-reflection rather than adherence to a script. For many, this feels overwhelming. Emotional authenticity also disrupts power dynamics. False self-images often carry implicit hierarchies. One person may derive power from appearing more composed, more knowledgeable, or more morally upright. Authenticity levels the field. It does not compete, but it refuses to play roles. This refusal can be interpreted as defiance. The person with the false self-image may feel their authority slipping. Envy can emerge at this point, not because the authentic person seeks influence, but because they possess it without effort. Their influence comes from coherence rather than control. Jung believed that psychological coherence is deeply attractive because it reflects inner unity. Those who lack this unity feel its absence acutely when they encounter it in others. The threat of authenticity is especially strong for individuals who have invested heavily in their persona for survival. If their social acceptance, career success, or family role depends on maintaining a particular image, questioning it feels dangerous. Emotional authenticity appears reckless. It challenges the belief that safety comes from conformity and control. Rather than integrating authenticity into their own lives, some people attempt to discredit it. They may frame it as naive, impractical, or emotionally indulgent. These judgments protect the false self-image by redefining authenticity as a flaw. Jung noted that when values are threatened, they are often attacked rather than examined. The empath, sensing this resistance, may experience confusion. They may wonder why their honesty provokes tension or why their presence feels unwelcome despite good intentions. Understanding the threat authenticity poses to false self-images helps clarify this confusion. The reaction is not personal. It is structural. It arises from a clash between being and appearing. At a deeper psychological level, emotional authenticity threatens the ego's illusion of control. The persona allows the ego to predict outcomes by following rules and roles. Authenticity responds to the moment. It cannot be fully anticipated or managed. This unpredictability unsettles those who equate control with safety. Jung believed that the psyche strives for wholeness, even when the ego resists. Authentic individuals unconsciously align with this movement. They live closer to their inner truth, even when it is inconvenient. This alignment exerts pressure on those who have organized their lives around avoidance. The pressure is not intentional, but it is real. For the empath, recognizing this dynamic is crucial. It prevents self-blame and over-accommodation. It clarifies why some people feel threatened without obvious cause. Jung emphasized the importance of psychological boundaries, especially for those who are emotionally perceptive. Boundaries allow authenticity to remain intact without becoming self-sacrificing. Ultimately, the threat of emotional authenticity reveals the cost of living behind a false self-image. The discomfort it provokes is not caused by authenticity itself, but by the distance between who a person is and who they pretend to be. The empath does not create this distance, they illuminate it. Whether this illumination leads to growth or hostility depends on the individual's willingness to confront their inner division. Some will recognize the opportunity to become more whole. Others will defend the persona at all costs. Jung believed that both responses are part of the psychological journey. The empath's role is not to force transformation, but to remain true to themselves. In remaining authentic, the empath preserves their own psychological integrity. They cannot shrink to protect another's illusion without losing themselves. And in Jung's view, but also shadows of pain and suffering. Projection is one of the most powerful and misunderstood psychological mechanisms described by Carl Jung. It occurs when an individual unconsciously attributes their own disowned feelings, desires, fears, or conflicts to another person. Rather than recognizing these qualities as part of their inner world, they experience them as originating outside themselves. In relationships involving empaths, projection often becomes the bridge that transforms admiration into resentment, closeness into rivalry, and affection into quiet hostility. At the beginning, the empath is often idealized. Their emotional depth, compassion, and intuitive understanding feel comforting and even inspiring. The projecting individual may feel understood in a way they rarely have before. Jung noted that projection often starts positively. We project our ideals, hopes, and longings onto others before we project our fears and inadequacies. The empath becomes a symbolic figure, representing emotional safety, wholeness, or moral clarity that the other person unconsciously yearns for. This idealization, however, is unstable. It is not based on seeing the empath as a separate, complex individual, but as a container for unconscious needs. As long as the empath continues to fulfill this symbolic role, the relationship feels harmonious. But the moment the empath asserts boundaries, expresses independence, or simply remains authentic without catering to expectations, the projection begins to crack. Jung emphasized that projection collapses when the other person fails to conform to the unconscious image placed upon them. When this happens, the psyche experiences disappointment and threat simultaneously. The projecting individual feels betrayed, not because the empath has done something wrong, but because they have failed to embody an internal fantasy. The qualities once admired now become sources of irritation. This is where projection transforms admiration into resentment. The empath's emotional strength, once comforting, now highlights the other person's emotional weakness. The empath's self-awareness, once inspiring, now exposes the projector's confusion. The empath's boundaries, once respected, now feel like rejection. None of this is consciously recognized. Instead, The emotional discomfort seeks an external cause. Projection provides that cause. The individual begins to assign negative intent to the empath. Compassion is reframed as manipulation. Insight is reframed as judgment. Calmness is reframed as superiority. Jung described this process as the shadow turning outward. The individual cannot tolerate seeing these uncomfortable qualities in themselves, so they locate them in the empath. Resentment grows because projection allows the person to feel justified. Rather than experiencing envy or inadequacy, they experience moral outrage or emotional grievance. They believe the empath is the problem. This belief restores temporary psychological balance. The ego is protected from shame, and the inner conflict is displaced. What makes this dynamic particularly painful is that it often occurs in relationships where love is claimed or genuinely felt on some level. The projecting individual may sincerely believe they care for the empath. Their resentment does not negate this feeling, it coexists with it. Jung acknowledged that human emotions are rarely consistent. Love and hostility can exist simultaneously when unconscious material is involved. The empath, sensing the shift, may feel confused. They remember the initial warmth and connection. They may attempt to repair the relationship through reassurance, explanation, or increased emotional availability. Unfortunately, this often intensifies the projection. The more the empath engages, the more emotional material the projector has to work with. Projection thrives on ambiguity. Because it is unconscious, it does not respond to logic or reassurance. The empath's attempts to clarify intentions may be interpreted as defensiveness or manipulation. Jung warned that once projection is active, perception is distorted. The other person is no longer seen clearly, they are seen symbolically. As resentment deepens, rivalry can emerge. The projecting individual may begin to compete with the empath emotionally, socially, or morally. They may seek to undermine the empath's credibility or diminish their influence. This rivalry is not always obvious. It can be subtle, expressed through comparison, dismissal, or strategic withdrawal of support. This competitive turn reflects a deeper struggle for psychological equilibrium. The empath's presence has destabilized the projector's self-image. By turning admiration into rivalry, the individual attempts to reclaim a sense of superiority or control. Jung believed that rivalry often masks unacknowledged dependency. The person competes with what they secretly feel they need. Projection also explains why resentment toward empaths often feels disproportionate. The intensity of emotion does not match the empath's behavior. Small actions provoke strong reactions. Minor boundaries feel like major betrayals. This disproportion signals that the emotion does not belong entirely to the present interaction. It is amplified by unresolved inner conflicts from the past. Early attachment wounds often fuel this process. If the projecting individual experienced inconsistent care, emotional neglect, or conditional love, they may unconsciously expect similar patterns in adulthood. The empath initially feels like a corrective experience, someone who offers what was missing. When the empath inevitably proves human and limited, old wounds resurface. Projection bridges the past and present. Instead of recognizing these wounds, the individual externalizes them. The empath is blamed for triggering pain that existed long before the relationship. Jung described this as a failure of differentiation, the inability to separate inner experience from outer reality. The empath becomes a stand-in for unresolved figures from the past. Resentment solidifies when projection is reinforced by narrative. The individual begins to tell themselves a story about the empath. This story explains their discomfort in terms of the empath's supposed flaws. Once established, this narrative filters all future interactions. Evidence that contradicts it is ignored or reinterpreted. Jung noted that unconscious narratives can be remarkably resilient. For the empath, this stage is often the most damaging. They may feel misrepresented, misunderstood, or unfairly judged. Because empaths value emotional truth, being seen inaccurately is deeply distressing. Without awareness, they may internalize the accusations, questioning their own intentions and worth. Jung emphasized the importance of withdrawing projections, both our own and those placed upon us. For the empath, this means recognizing that resentment rooted in projection does not define them. It belongs to the other person's psychological process. This recognition is not cold detachment, but clarity. Projection only dissolves when the individual takes responsibility for their inner world. This requires self-reflection, humility, and often guidance. Many people resist this process because it destabilizes the ego. It is easier to resent than to integrate. As a result, some relationships never move beyond this stage. Admiration decays into resentment, and resentment hardens into emotional distance or conflict. Yet from a Jungian perspective, projection is not merely destructive. It is also a potential doorway to growth. When resentment is examined rather than acted out, it can reveal valuable information about unmet needs and disowned traits. The empath, unintentionally, becomes a catalyst for this revelation. Whether this catalyst leads to transformation or rupture depends on the individual's readiness. Those willing to confront their projections may eventually see the empath more clearly and reclaim the qualities they once admired. Those unwilling will cling to resentment, using it to reinforce their defenses. In a broader sense, this dynamic reflects a collective psychological pattern. Empathy, emotional literacy, and inner awareness are often projected onto individuals rather than cultivated collectively. Those who embody these qualities become symbolic carriers of what society neglects. They are admired, idealized, and then resented when they fail to carry the burden alone. Jung believed that psychological health requires reclaiming projections and integrating the shadow. Until this happens, relationships will continue to oscillate between idealization and devaluation. The empath's experience of triggering resentment is not a personal failure, but a reflection of this unresolved process. For the empath, the task is not to avoid projection, but to avoid living inside it. This requires strong boundaries, self-trust, and an understanding of unconscious dynamics. It means accepting that not everyone who admires you is prepared to see you clearly, and not everyone who resents you understands why. Ultimately, projection transforms admiration into resentment because it replaces reality with fantasy. The empath disrupts that fantasy by being real. In Jung's view, reality is always the antidote to illusion, even when it provokes pain. The resentment it triggers is not a sign of harm, but a sign that something true has been touched. And in the quiet aftermath of that touch, each individual must choose whether to turn inward with honesty or outward with blame.